Want to keep God's Word with you wherever you go? The King James Bible Study KJV app by Salem Media makes it easy to read, study, share, and pray daily with the timeless KJV translation. Enjoy features like offline access, audio Bible listening, smart search, and tools to highlight, bookmark, and take notes, all designed to keep your Bible study simple and organized. Best of all, it's free to download in the Google Play Store. Grow in your faith every day. Search for King James Bible Study KJV and download the app today.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. I'd very much like to welcome today John Fagant, trustee of the Buffalo Presidential Center. I heard about John from personal friend and friend of the show, Jerry Landry's Presidencies of the United States podcast. And as soon as I heard that his guest, John Fagant, was a fellow Buffalonian with interest in the early 19th century history and Buffalo history, I really made it my mission to have him on the program. So we're really going to have a wide-ranging discussion on Catholic history, immigration, anti-immigration, and much more. And really, I think that'll help us focus in on this Catholic history of the United States because Buffalo was really a capsule of that history. So I can't wait to get started. And to start, John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Buffalo Presidential Society?
Okay, thank you, Stephen. About myself, I retired a few years ago. I had been in research labs, specifically in the aviation industry. But on the side, I had been doing a lot of tours, and I had become a tour docent for Martin House, Frank Lloyd Wright, and also for Buffalo Tours, and more recently Explore Buffalo, which gives various tours of the city and the region. And recently I've just joined the Presidential Center. I've known Bren Price from there for many years, and he's been talking about getting me in there. The Presidential Center Buffalo Presidential Center came about decades ago when two women, Marianne Sacramento Friedman and Joan Bozer, both friends, had recognized the connection Buffalo had to many of the presidents. And they went out and found a few collectors from the region, including Bren Price and Mark Evans. And for years, they were just floating from place to place as far as where they were. But in 2021, they were able to get a location, permanent location in the downtown Central Library up on the second floor. And ironically, Mark Poloncarz opened the center in April of 2021, and then he went outside into the main library and closed the library and the center because of the COVID. So I've been in it since then. And the idea behind the center is to make Western New York and county aware of Buffalo's presidential history. We do that by having programs at the center. We also go out into the community and have speakers. And most recently, we've had two new board members come on that have great connections to the school systems. And one of them put together a presidential Jeopardy game last May, in which they were able to get 4th to 6th graders come in and play this against one of our so-called experts. And it was a lot of fun, I have to say. They had it all set up on the screen, different topics to choose, and everybody booed when executive or when one of us got it right, but they cheered when the kids got it right. So it was a lot of fun, and so we're hoping to continue that as a nice way of making a connection. And we've had Last year we had, even beyond the presidents, we have those connected with the presidents. Shirley Chisholm, she's not generally known for Buffalo, but she's buried here. In her later life, she married a Buffalonian, and she's buried in Forest Lawn. So we had a program on her. We had a program on the Miller sisters, who were William Miller's daughters, and he was the VP candidate with Goldwater in 1964. They came in last year. And there's also a grandson of Grover Cleveland that has come in and made an appearance. So we're a work in progress. But it's I have to admit, it's an exciting group to be with. I really enjoy it.
That's awesome. If I am not mistaken, a little historical fun fact, isn't the location of where the current downtown library was where Grover Cleveland, when he was sheriff of Erie County, in Buffalo's, yes, the county seat, was where he would hang people?
Yes, you are correct in that. Yeah, it's right off of Lafayette Square, right across. And Grover Cleveland he was a sheriff. He was the sheriff, and he refused to give that duty to an underling. He figured he had to do the dirty work himself. And apparently he's the only president to ever actually pull the ringer on hanging somebody. Wow. So wow. I don't know if that's worthy or not, but it's I haven't heard of anybody else doing it.
It definitely says something, and I'm not sure exactly what, but it's something.
Yeah, the library is built over that area. That used to be where the county courthouse was.
So we're going to focus in a bit on, or really the main focus of today is Catholic religious immigration history of Buffalo. And really, like I had said in the beginning, Buffalo, would you say it was reflective of sort of the growing cities and growing immigration and growing Catholic population in the United States at that time period?
I honestly can't compare it to everywhere else, but I can say that the Erie Canal played a major part in bringing immigrants out this way. And in the early years, before the vast immigration came out here, Buffalo really had only a very small Catholic presence. They'd have an itinerant priest come through. They didn't really have a church in the early 1820s, say, and they often borrowed the church from the Protestants. So they were small enough to where there was not that anger yet or that hatred grown up. But by 1829, one of the local residents, a Frenchman, and I can't speak French, but his name is Louis Lecatux. Yeah, you familiar with the name?
Yeah, I am not.
Okay, I mean he was from France. L-E, and it's capital COULTEULX. So I know the French don't pronounce everything. So it's you get here and it's Lecatux, but it's French and it's Lecatux. But anyways, he had been here for a while, and he donated land for the Catholic growth in the city, and this was in 1829, and that eventually became the St. Louis Roman Catholic Church. And in 1831, they had their first mass there, and the parish consisted mainly of some Germans, even Alsatians, Irish, French, some from Quebec. They even had Swiss, which I found interesting, but they moved on pretty quickly. But anyways, by 1843, the Catholic population had doubled, and there was only one diocese in the state. It was a Catholic diocese covering the whole state, with the headquarters being in New York City. So the upstate Catholics essentially were on their own, except for visiting priests, up until 1840 or so. And the St. Louis Church, well, let me get into the immigration period before I get into St. Louis Church, because that's a fascinating story in itself, as it was one of the issues with the Know Nothings. 45 to 55, the immigration finally picked up. I'm sure you're familiar with the starvation and the political motives. Mainly Irish and Germans were coming over, many of them settling in the Buffalo area. And at this later period, about the 40s and 50s, they were Irish Catholics, German Catholics. Interestingly, in the 20s, some were Protestants, Irish Protestants from Northern Ireland. But by 1855, a dramatic shift had taken place in the city, as 60% of the city was immigrants. 30,000 Germans, 20,000 Irish. So the native New Englanders and New York upstaters that had moved in here, now you're starting to feel pressure once the Catholic versus Protestant is coming in there, immigrant versus native is coming in there. So they're starting to have issues. The Germans settled on the east side of Buffalo, which made sense. It's inland from the river and from the lake, and Germany itself is more inland. So that was a natural place for them to go into. They were more skilled than the Irish were. They were shoemakers, bakers, clockmakers, stonemakers. So they were considered skilled individuals who could set up shop. The Irish coming in at the time were generally unskilled. So they went to the waterfront and they worked in transitioning of products going from lake to canal or from Erie Canal into the lake. So you needed physical, raw, strong muscle for that. But the Germans had set up quite a society inland, and it was quoted by one of the newspapers of the time in 1854. They said their customs, the German customs, are as unknown to us as those of the Tartars. So they were a strange group over in the east side of Buffalo, mainly because of the language. I mean, the Germans had several of their own German newspapers. They did develop singing societies, which was very positive for the whole community, their own churches. They made attempts to have their German language schools funded publicly, but that failed. And they also tried to make German a bilingual language in the city, but that also failed. So by 1850, they're politically active in the region.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today. So by 1850, what's the population of Buffalo and how much has it changed really? And you don't have to give us exact numbers, but it's kind of exploded by that point.
Yes, 1830. Well, when the Erie Canal came in 1825, you're talking about 2,500. 1830, you're up to 5,000. 1840, you're up to 18,000. So you've almost tripled. 1850, you're up to 60, 70,000. By the Civil War, there were 80,000 in the city alone, not counting the surrounding areas. In fact, in 1860, Buffalo was the 10th largest city in the country. So it is. And most of it's through immigration. And it was an explosion. You're going from 2,500 frontier settlement in 25 to 25, 30 years later up to a major sized city in the country.
Yeah, more or less one generation. And I can't do the math on that in my head, but it's definitely exponential growth.
Yes. And that's many cities have seen that type of growth, and it's not unusual, but when your time is there, it happens. And at this time with the transportation, the communication, the westward movement, Buffalo became it was in a prime location, so it could handle, or it was forced to handle, let's put it that way, the growth and the back and forth between the canal and later the railroad coming through there. And both of those really sparked immigration. They sparked people going through, but also many of them stayed in the city to work and grow.
And then I wonder with that sort of growth, and I think anybody who's familiar with American history, there was a lot of stress on existing systems to support immigrants and support the different people. And was that something that the city government was picking up, or was the Catholic Church and the immigrant societies, like you said, mentioned the singing society, but there was all different sorts of societies that they had developed. Was the church leading in that? Were they involved at all? Were they developed enough?
As I said, the Catholic diocese was all New York State. But in 1847, they split up and they made a diocese of Buffalo. And that's when Bishop John Timon came in as the first bishop of Buffalo. Now, he jumped on a lot of things right away. He recruited religious orders from Europe to come over, and they did establish ministries such as orphanages, schools, hospitals, poorhouses. The Protestant leaders also had, the poorhouses, and they were also expanding into public school systems at that time. So there became a confrontation between the two styles, parochial versus the public. But Timon, he was a very interesting individual as far as he often quoted himself as being born in Pennsylvania, conceived in Ireland. So his parents were Irish who came over, but he was American. And in his early years, he was actually a missionary out west to the Native Americans and settlers out there. And in fact, his early history before coming to Buffalo was that of working mainly with non-Catholics, I should say. Not that he converted many, but he learned how to work with them. And so he had that coming in to the city. So when he became a bishop of Buffalo, he's got the Irish background. The church is the Catholic Church at that time is in a ethnic struggle. Now, if we go back to that St. Louis church, just before Timon came in there, St. Louis was the main church, but they had Germans, they had Irish, they had French in there. And, when you think about what wins over, the religion or the ethnicities, in this case, the ethnic backgrounds did. So when the German preacher was up there, the Irish and French would boo and throw things at him. And then the same thing when the Irish were in there, it did not connect well. And in fact, the Irish moved out in the early 40s before Timon got there. And then the French moved out. They put up their own church, St. Peter's. And even the new Germans at that point, in the 1840s, they clashed with the old Germans. So you're having a lot of issues there. So Timon comes in, he's dealing with that. But to answer your question, yes, he also was mainly going with the any way he could help the poor, because he was more associated with the Irish at that point. He had the Germans didn't really want him at St. Louis, so he had moved out. That's where the bishop's see was supposed to be. He moved out of there, and went to the Irish church, which was much, much smaller. And he was more comfortable with them. And the battle began. But the Irish being poorer in general, he did attempt through. He would bringing in missionary groups from Europe and raising money, and he would set up poorhouses. And he was significant in getting that going in the Buffalo area. Now the Protestants also had that too. So this is the days before welfare, of course, 150 years earlier before that. So it's that's how they were dealing with it, attempting to anyways.
And Timon is an interesting character, Bishop Timon, because he really represents a lot of what Catholic priests had to do back then. Frontier priest moves. I think he was educated at the seminary in Baltimore, then moves on to Louisville, which was a common. And then I think he was the prelate for the Republic of Texas, then winds up in Buffalo. And Buffalo was truly a frontier town at that time. So that all this, the really organizing the frontier at this time, it's a real organizational phase, a consolidating phase, but also explosive growth at the same time.
You're right. Timon did have quite a journey. He did get as far as Texas and out west. And so, in fact, he was offered the diocese of, I believe, St. Louis and a few others, and he kept on turning them down. He really didn't want to give up his missionary status. But then I think Buffalo was like the seventh one offered to him. And he felt like, well, if I don't take it, they'll never offer me anything again. So maybe I should take it. So he, in 47, he took it. But, Buffalo at that time was more than a frontier town. It was, there was culture performed in that period. There were theaters, and it was combination. It was losing its frontier aura and gaining a more cultured view of itself, and starting to think of itself as more of an eastern city rather than a frontier city. But the old timers, they're seeing the immigrants coming in, and they're saying, "Oh, it's not as good as the good old days." So everybody thinks the good old days were good, and that is sometimes one of the frustrations of working with groups. But one thing Timon had was his quality of being able to work with everybody. He had been, his work as a missionary, he was, like I said, he was mainly working with non-Catholics. He learned how to work with non-Catholics. And he did present himself in such a way to the city here. Now, he had a charisma that was acceptable in public. He knew how to present himself and attempt to get things the way he wanted to. He didn't get everything he wanted by any means, but, he was trying to get money for private schools, parochial, which never happened. And he was the one thing he did do, which surprised the Protestant elite, was he was always raising money, and they knew he was going to build a cathedral, but they assumed he was going to build it in the first ward where the Irish were. But he had bought a piece of land, which turned out to be one of the prime pieces in the city of Buffalo, right on the terrace. And that's where he built St. Joseph's Cathedral in 1850. And that was a shock to everybody. But it still stands today. It's quite a presence. But it was right on the terrace, which at that point overlooked the harbor area. Now it's cityfied and built up. The view isn't as great as it would have been back then, but it's in a dominant place. Well, it's on Church Street. It's in the Church Street area where you have, at the time you had a Presbyterian church, which still stands, and you had a Episcopal church. So you still had, it was in the church region, which shocked the Protestants and made them nervous, the Protestant elite. So he was, and at the same time, although he put on a positive view to the public, he was often, he wasn't like everybody. He's got, personality issues. And his issue was more with his own priests, where he would get angry and put them in place. And in the process, he got in poor relations with his priests. So that was an issue that had to be dealt with for him.
So you've started to get a little bit into that. There was some of the Protestants were getting a little maybe uncomfortable, you might say, with the amount of immigration and the growth of the Catholic Church. Talk a little bit about nativism, and then eventually which builds into the Know Nothing movement.
Okay. We're talking the 1840s and 1850s. And one thing that comes out, the Commercial Advertiser was one of the daily newspapers that was an organ of the Whig Party, Fillmore's paper, and later it became a Republican party paper afterwards. But they described the 1840s as a time of riots and mobs and crimes, which gave fearful foreboding. Well, what were they afraid of? They were crying for crime and drunkenness and poverty in the city's ethnic ghettos. Well, the ethnic ghettos were the Irish and the Germans. The African Americans really had very small presence here. So they were so small that they weren't. Not that they were untouched, but they were nowhere near the level of the Irish and German immigrants. And out of that, the fearfulness came out of crimes, which always comes to play anytime immigrants come into play. The other side always cries crime. And demand for women's rights was coming out there. Like you said, this was very unsettling for the city's Protestant establishment, which was known as the WASP, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the Commercial Advertiser did mention that the 25 Protestant churches of the region stand as a beacon to the fearful dangers to which men are exposed. They don't mention any of the Catholic churches being a beacon. So there is that in the age-old saying, life is cheaper than it was a quarter century ago. The good old days are always better. So rise in murder. But there was an interesting take on this. One of the Catholics, after hearing that all the prisons were filled with Catholics, and he went out on his own to check that out. He wanted to see for himself, was that really true? And he was given permission to check the jail. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but he came back and he found that there were something like 100 German immigrants in the jail. There were about 225 Irish immigrants in the jail. And there were over 400 natives in the jail. So even though it disproved the idea that jails are filled with the immigrants, it didn't do much to. It was just a fact. It wasn't. It didn't relieve anybody. But it was an interesting take that he found that out, that it wasn't just all immigrants, and it's all across the city. We have a whole big group across the city that's involved there. But the response, they did the Protestant response was in a few different ways. One was through education. Another was through temperance. The other was just the marketing view of the Roman Catholic Church being an apostate church, and therefore it's not Christian. They had a Sabbatarian movement, and then eventually the rise of the Know Nothing. But if you look at it from the beginning, the education, the Protestants created a public school system. And in the 50s, they created a central high school. Now, at the same time, Timon is also creating a parochial system here. So they're competing against each other. And Timon's trying to get public funds for those parochial. So that's setting off them. The temperance movement is was a main backlash, obviously implied, against the Germans and the Irish who came in. The Germans were brewers, and the Irish were well known to take of alcohol. And so there's a temperance newspaper, a temperance hotel. There's generally attack on the immigrants itself. And then when you look at the church as an apostate and therefore not Christian view, one interesting, they're basing a lot of that on their experiences in Europe, the ones that had any connection to Europe, and of course the history of the church there, and the rise of Lutheranism and all, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Of course, all that is still in the minds of many, and the fear that the church is going to come in and start taking over things. And Timon, with his personality, was such that he did. At times it didn't help in his view of.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Want to keep God's word with you wherever you go? The King James Bible Study KJV app by Salem Media makes it easy to read, study, share, and pray daily with the timeless KJV translation. Enjoy features like offline access, audio Bible listening, smart search, and tools to highlight, bookmark, and take notes, all designed to keep your Bible study simple and organized. Best of all, it's free to download in the Google Play Store. Grow in your faith every day. Search for King James Bible Study KJV and download the app today.
Yeah, and public schooling is really interesting because, like you said, I think I may get into this in future episodes, is that it was public, but it was really a Protestant operation. And you mentioned Buffalo Central High School. That was my alma mater.
Oh, really?
High school. It would eventually turn into. I don't think it was in the same building at that point. I think the current building was built a little bit later, maybe in the 1860s or the 1870s. But it is really interesting in that there was a real push and pull of whether to follow sort of a more European system where the government would fund all schooling, and the Catholic Church had to figure out how it was going to fit into this public school system. And it really went off on its own with the parochial school system.
Well, for me, Timon trying to get public money for this reminded me of my own time at St. Francis in the 70s, where they were still trying to get public money for parochial schools. So it was it's been a common theme over the years, and it was your point of the public schools being a Protestant institution. They did use the Bible back then, and it was the Protestant Bible. And that was also one of the issues where the Catholics were fighting it, saying, well, when our kids go there, they're getting the Protestant Bible, and we don't like that. And of course, we know that the Bible has some different Catholic and Protestant Bible. I think Catholic has a few more books in it than Protestant does. And there's all this movement on there. It's even the Sabbatarian movement, which was the Protestants took Sunday as a serious day of non-joy, whereas the German culture and their Catholicism coming over was to have Sunday picnics, and that was frowned upon. And of course, the Irish, were, let's just say the immigrants were more active on Sundays than the Protestants were, and that brought up all types of hostility towards them. So there's this issue, the prejudicial tone of much of it shows up in the press, and the press is often mocking towards the Irish and Germans in their wards. Catholics were blamed for everything from being rowdies and drunkards to fill the prisons. Oh, here it is. I found it. Natives in the prison. The natives were 496 people, Irish 227, and the Germans 136. So that was the one Catholic individual went. He said, hey, your argument is not right, but
it's fairly close to 50-50 native meaning
native to
Protestant English.
And at a time when the population was 60% immigrant. Yes. So, and all this was fearful. It was fearful, but this was a period. Now, if you get to the nativist movement, the 1850s really pick it up. But the Know Nothing Party had little or no. It was formed in 1850. I think in New York City, a guy named Allen. I think it was the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. It was a small feature. 1850. There were other orders around the country at that time, but they would not have. They only had 40 members or so, and they would not have survived unless something happened. In 1853, 54 is when you have a major early 55. You have a major influx of immigrants, and that's, I think, mainly from the potato famine and from some wars in Europe from the 1848 revolutions that took place. So you have people coming over from that to escaping that also. So if you look at the influx of immigrants, you'll see those 2-3 years are a high spike over previous years and years after. Now, what that did push nativism to the front of the order. Now, this is at a time when anti-slavery has been big on the border. So the growth of the Know Nothing Party takes place, and what's a couple features that really helped in it were the Catholic schools, although the immigration level going up at the Catholic schools, degrading the public schools and wanting parochial schools, which we talked about, and debate over Catholic Church property. St. Louis, one of the issues there, St. Louis Church, the issue there was that Bishop Timon wanted to take over the property, but the trustees had already had the property for years. They wanted to keep management of it. They didn't want to hand it over, so it became a big issue. And it was, for Protestants, a board of trustees held the property of a church. For the Catholics, in certain areas, the bishop would hold property, but the Germans were different. They had the trustees holding the property. So that became, and then the Vatican sent over a man named an archbishop or a Cardinal Bedini trying to solve the problem, but he was known to the immigrants as a ruthless bishop who took pleasure in executing exiles from the 1848. So he was a terrible one to bring forth, and the newspapers across the country were tearing him apart. And then President Pierce, a Protestant, he put a postmaster named James Campbell, who was a Catholic. He put him as postmaster general in his administration. The postmaster back then controlled most of the patronage of the presidency, so that really set off a major storm. Now, he was elected in 52, started in 53. So we're in that same period where all these things are going on, and it's the Know Nothing Party is taking off because everything's falling into place where nativism is, for a couple of years there, is becoming the major source. So it's also the point where the Whig Party and the Democrats are starting to fall apart. The Whigs, especially after the 1852 election, Scott had lost to Pierce, they started falling apart mainly from the slavery issue. They became more northern, southern. Democrats also became that. but many of the Democrats still held on to the pro-Southern beliefs. But the Whigs were falling apart, and there was a vacuum there for a new party to jump into, and that's when the Know-Nothings went from just a secret organization into a political organization. And that was the rise of the Know-Nothings, or the American Party. They were Know-Nothings because of they would have secret meetings and say, I know nothing about anything of it to the public. So 1854 was a major year for the Know-Nothings as far as elections. They did get I believe, a couple of governors elected. I think Massachusetts and Vermont. They did put many into the Congress and the House of Representatives, and in statewide areas, statewide positions. So the Republican Party is just beginning to form, but the Know-Nothings have taken this nativism to a higher level, and they are trying to make. But the nativists also offered anti-slavery elements to them. They also offered levels of temperance, political reform. So they were able to draw in many that were unsure of where they were going at that time. Some in 54 to 56, it was just a one-time vote, and it wasn't passionate believers. But the Know-Nothings in, I think it was June of 1855, tried in their Philadelphia Convention. They attempted to unite all their disparate parts. And they tried doing that by claiming now, okay, we accept the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 54, which they had not previously. And we're going to get out of the anti-slavery business. We're going to, and immediately politicians started leaving that group, not believing that they could go to the Republican Party instead. And because by 55, nativism starting to fall down, and the anti-slavery movement is once again taking over the broad issue. That's becoming the main issue for many Americans. So, in Buffalo, the Know-Nothing Party was hitting there, and it was big for a few years. The 56 election, which was the highlight of the party, but they only got 27% of Buffalo's vote, even though Fillmore, a Buffalonian, was on the ticket. And then afterwards, it fell apart.
I can really see why you're so interested in this time period, because it sure seems to me that the 1850s is maybe the most tumultuous decade in American history.
Isn't it fun? Oh, years ago, when I was a kid, the Civil War was big, but then, as I grew older and started reading, I said, what's really fun is the lead up to a great event. That's why I also enjoy, the 1930s, and the U.S. and Europe, and the build up to World War II. Sometimes the build up is just so exciting. How is it? It had to be fantastic. Congress had some of the greatest talks of that period. Henry Clay, there was one, Fillmore, when he was vice president in 1850. He was the Senate president. And he heard the talks of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, the last one of John C. Calhoun, William Seward's famous talk. It was the highlight of oratory in the Senate. It's such an exciting time, and I stay with it a lot. Sometimes I jump around here and there, but I always come back to it at some point. Just such a fascinating period, and the Know-Nothings. Well, with that Philadelphia Convention of June 1855, that was their peak. So it's just a year before the presidency. In 55, they're thinking they can win the presidency. But the convention then goes against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which many of the members had joined because of that. And after they pulled out of that, they lost many of their anti-slavery members. And now the party is controlled by a group known as the Silver Gray Whigs. In New York State, you had the Whigs had two parties, the Seward Party and the Fillmore Party. And the Fillmore Party was the Silver Grays, a conservative section of it. So now with the Silver Grays now in charge of the Know Nothing, they are more interested in unionism as a feature rather than nativism. And that was one of the features that Fillmore found. He was always like Daniel Webster and Clay at those times, the union. We must preserve the union. And Fillmore was in that class. We must preserve the union. And he's looking for a party that has the unionist class. He feels the Republic. If you elect the Republicans, we're going to go to war, as many felt, and they were right. And if you elect the Democrats, we're going to go to war, and they were correct. And so Fillmore and other conservative Whigs like him are going into this Know Nothing party. Fillmore at the time is in Europe. He's traveling through Europe. And just to get into him for a minute, I went to a talk about 20 years ago, but when I was just learning about Fillmore, and the speaker said Fillmore, they were talking about the Know Nothing party, and they said Fillmore hated the Catholics. And I said, I don't know. That doesn't sound right to me. So I started doing some of my own research. And the Know Nothing party, I think, was a terrible political decision. But the reason it wasn't because he hated Catholics or immigrants. It was because of the unionist movement. I got a quote here. I found it. When Fillmore came back from Europe, he landed in New York City. He was the nominee in 1856 for the American Know Nothing Party. So on his way from New York City back to Buffalo, his home, in various places, he gave talks, speeches, 27 talks. And all those 27 talks, he never mentioned anti-Catholicism, not once. When he did talk about foreigners, I have one quote here. It says, he said, "I have no hostility toward foreigners. I would open wide the gates and invite the oppressed of every land, excluding only the pauper and the criminal. I would be tolerant to men of all creeds, but would exact from all faithful allegiance to our republican institutions. Church and state should be separate, not only in form, but fact. Religion and politics should not be mingled." So he's now the Whigs had blamed immigrants for loss of elections, including Fillmore. Fillmore lost the 1844 governor election in New York State. And he did blame it on the immigrants. And there was justification to it because the immigrants coming into New York City had been gathered up by the Democrats, signed up, and sent to the polls. So there was some argument for that, for some kind of controls over who can vote and, how long you should be in the country. So he did have frustration on that. But as you can see from that quote, he has no hostility toward foreigners. We all came from somewhere else. But he did feel that Americans should govern America. Immigrants should, not go into politics immediately. And he did have, he had. I found this other one. If one wants to argue Fillmore's anti-Catholic, why did he do this then? 1840, he attended a Catholic church while he was a congressman in Washington. And he wrote a letter to his son who was in Buffalo. And he said, "I attended the Catholic church today and heard an Irishman preach. He was very theatrical in his manner, but he preached a good sermon." So he attended a Catholic church. Now, there's also a point where he, in Buffalo, had sent his daughter to a Catholic convent for some learning. And also, he was known for his philanthropic views, and he also gave the church some money when they needed it. Catholic Church some money. I think they needed a new bell, and he donated money towards that. He donated towards a lot of things, but it's specifically Catholic in that case. So he doesn't have a hatred of them. And as I said, by 1956, the Nativist Party is turning more towards trying to be a unionist party. And they eventually go from know-nothings into the Constitutional Union Party of 1860, which John Bell was a presidential candidate, and he was also a part of the know-nothings.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Need a daily spark of hope and direction? Let the Daily Bible app from Salem Media be that spark. This free Android app delivers an uplifting verse each morning, plus reading plans, devotions, and trusted podcasts from leaders like Joyce Meyer and Rick Warren. Prefer to listen instead? The Daily Bible app reads verses, reading plans, and chapters aloud, handy for the headphones moment of your day. Choose from versions like ESV, NIV, KJV, and more, and bookmark favorites to revisit later. Share inspiring messages with loved ones right from the app. Feel God's presence in every notification. Search for Daily Bible app on Google Play and begin your day with hope, purpose, and peace.
It's interesting. I find that Millard Fillmore is one of the most misunderstood presidents because he really gets labeled almost as a villain leading up to the Civil War with the Fugitive Slave Act. But it was his ideology of unionism, which that's really what Abraham Lincoln was proposing just a few short years later.
They came up through this same level of Daniel Webster and unionism and Henry Clay and unionism. And even though he was on the other side of the political party, Andrew Jackson and unionism. And there was this special aura about keeping the union together. And you're right, Fillmore had that, and even Lincoln had that. And that's why that's one reason why Lincoln I don't think he took it seriously in 1961 that the South was really going to leave. Said they'll come back. There's too many unionists down there. But, he was wrong on that. But, yes, it's, I think, not only Fillmore, but yeah, as president, he does get, taken apart. Even in Buffalo himself, there's questions about it. And, even on the board, there's questions about it. How should we present him? And, we had a, visitor come in a few months ago, and we had on the board were Fillmore. Interesting. The first sentence, and I never picked up on it before, but it said a much maligned presidency. And the visitor said, "Why are you saying that?" And I've been to several presidents' homes and listened, and even the adequate ones, everybody's presenting their president in a positive vein. I said, well, we don't have to lie about anything, but we need to present both sides of it. He much of his history was presented by William Seward and Thurlow Weed as they were on the winning side, basically, of history. And although Fillmore, Weed, and Seward had started off together in the anti-Mason party in the 1930s, they grew apart by the 1940s. And by the time Fillmore was president, Seward and Weed were not his friends anymore. So there was this big break in the Whig Party with the both of them in New York State. So much of the later history comes from them, and they're slamming a Fillmore. But I like to look at it as that whole period, is fascinating for individuals as to how they're deciding, how they're acting based on what their moral belief is versus what the constitutional belief is versus, what the culture is putting out there, and you have Fillmore, he's a well-known anti-slavery man. Back in Congress, he voted with John Quincy Adams every single time against the gag rule, and he voted every single time against the South as a congressman. But when he got to the presidency, he said he would sign every bill that came out of Congress because it was if it was constitutional. And that was the thought of the Whig Party. And that was one of the reasons they didn't like Jackson, is because Jackson was vetoing bills because he thought personally he didn't like them. And the Whig view was, well, Congress is the legislative section. If they pass it and we believe it's constitutional, we should sign it whether we like it or not. But as far as the Compromise of 1850, a lot came out of that one. And Fillmore came into that crisis when he was went from vice president to president in July 1850. And he said, at that point, he said to Congress, look, you get me those bills, and if they're constitutional, I'll sign them. So they sent them to him. He settled the Texas borderline with New Mexico, which was the most controversial part of that period. We don't think of it anymore, but it was at the time. But that's where possible civil war was going to happen. And then he signed California into law, as a free state. He signed New Mexico in as a territory to decide for themselves on slavery. And he ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And then finally, as a gift to the South, he signs the reprehensible fugitive slave law, which in the original Constitution, it's there. But over the years, 1793, they had enhanced fugitive slave law. And then over the years, there's battle. And then finally in 1850, the South, at least the Upper South, insisted on we need more strictness on being able to capture our fugitives. So he's criticized for that, and also for the idea of enforcing that law, which of course is what the president is supposed to do. But those are typically selective things. So he I can listen to any side of the argument, tell you the truth on this. He did some, I think overall, I think he did some very good things, and he handled himself as a president in a way that, a president should, following the Constitution and such. But I can, even he regretted signing it, I think, or at least in that form. He said he could have pushed years later. He said, he could have pushed for, maybe a trial by jury or, habeas corpus or so. I find him fascinating. I know some historians say they don't even want to. He's so boring, you don't want to touch him. I find him fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
The whole period. I mean, you got Zachary Taylor, a Southerner who's doing Northern demands. You got Fillmore. I wouldn't say he was doing Southern demands, but as president, of course, the fugitive slave law was a pro-Southern one, but he also pushed against the filibustering that the South was doing in their attempt to get Cuba to become part of a slave state. So he was threatening to send troops into South Carolina at one point. So he was hoping the North would see that side of his argument, which they did not. And but his presidency for 2.5 years is, I think, pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And really wrapping up, you've shown how Buffalo represented and was really central to all these big issues within the Catholic Church context in particular, where there was this battle between the trustees that controlled churches and the sort of the money side of it versus diocesan control and the bishop control. Rome getting involved with situations, the split within immigrant communities and these immigrant communities with the nativist population at large. It really is. And then, of course, a president who was central to these issues of slavery, and with slavery and the issues that were coming out of this Second Great Awakening that we talked about leading into the Burned Over District, which I really hope to get you back on to talk about, because that's a fascinating topic of American and particularly upstate New York history.
Yes, that was like setting the plate for a lot of movements, including abolitionism.
Yeah, I think that is so critical, is that, and I don't know how you feel about it in your studies, but for me, whenever I look at the Second Great Awakening in the burned over district, that really was the touch point that set off, that really became that slavery wasn't an issue anymore that could just be compromised away. And I think maybe that's the problem that Millard Fillmore stepped into, is that it became a religiously divisive issue, and it became what would later be called a wedge issue, that you couldn't straddle the line anymore on an issue like that.
Every group has its breakups. The abolition group, you're right. I agree with you in the sense that it brought about William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, I don't think was directly involved in the burned over district, but it brought out the religious aspects. I think Theodore Dwight Weld is a better example. He was converted by Finney, and he in the 1830s, he was probably the greatest of the abolitionists, along with at least the guy on the ground, whereas Garrison was in Massachusetts. But yes, I agree with you. It brings about a lot of issues, but even the abolition group, goes from religious to political to violence. They split off into their own little groups, with anti-slavery being the umbrella. And at the very liberal end of it, if you will, you have the immediatism of William Lloyd Garrison. I don't know if that's liberal or not, but, because it's a highly religious viewpoint also. And then on the other end, you have the Free Soil Party, where many of them didn't care about the slaves of the South. They just wanted to make sure the lands in the West were open to whites, or were closed to non-whites.
Fascinating topic.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a little teaser for what's coming up in future episodes. John, thank you so much for going on. Is there any parting comments you'd like to make? Or we've mentioned the Buffalo Presidential Center, and there'll be links for that in the show notes. But is there any closing comments you'd like to leave us with for today?
I think one thing that hits me is how consistent history is. Immigration has always been an issue. It fluxes up and down, certainly in the 1850s, 1920s. I think the late 1870s, 80s might have been more anti-Chinese. 1920s, it hits again and it fluxes. And then, well, of course, today it's another issue. So it's nothing's new in history. We can always look back and see, well, how did the others handle it? If we decide to? Well, generally we don't, but some of us like to do that. I would like to say that, if you do come, next time you're in Buffalo, please let me know. And
absolutely. We'll definitely take a tour.
We get the Presidential Center, which is a small museum, but it's a very nice one. And we also have many other places like the Theodore Roosevelt site. So there's presidential actions within and without. But yeah, thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it, Stephen.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth. as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.
Looking for a simple way to stay rooted in God's Word every day? The Daily Bible Devotion app by Salem Media gives you morning and evening devotionals designed to encourage, inspire, and keep you connected with Scripture. Plus, you'll enjoy daily Bible trivia and humor, a fun way to learn and share a smile while growing in your faith. Get the Daily Bible Devotion app for free on both iOS and Android. Start and end your day with God's Word. Search for the Daily Bible Devotion app in the App Store or Google Play Store and download it today.